Mr. Ambassador Valeri Kuzmin, thank you for receiving us and taking the time to speak with us. You've been ambassador here in Romania for a year. How did the Romania-Russia relationship evolve in this period?
Well, domnul Ionuţ, I am glad as well to greet the spectators of your channel. Indeed, marking almost exactly 1 year of my stay in Romania, I can say that our relations, of course, deserve better situation, but we are working on their improvement, on their, if you like, activation after a long period of more or less effective freeze or slowdown. And indeed, there are some achievements that could be mentioned, though they are modest enough. In particular, I'm happy that much more active, much wider and diversified become our business circles relations, because we believe that in spite of difficult political complications, including European Union's sanctions and countermeasures, economic countermeasures of Russian Federation, that were accepted back in 2014, there is enough room for pragmatic and mutually beneficial business interaction, cooperation, joint projects, and so on and so forth. And we can state that relatively recently there was a number of economic delegations, or if you like, business people groups that visited Russia, and one of the major trip could be mentioned in particular at the end of June. There was a big group of Romanian businessmen visiting chambers of commerce in Moscow, in Yaroslavl. As far as I am informed, they came back with very positive impressions, and I hope that that will be introduced gradually in practical cooperation, practical projects, trade deals, contracts. This is encouraging, of course. And I hope that something could be done more, though, of course, it will depend on the mutual political and other kinds of will. As far as you know, that international relations, they are basically built on the principle of reciprocity. Thank you for this question.
You mentioned some positive things, but there are also some tensions, and we can go around them. This year, Romania was the host of some quite big military drills, led by NATO or by the United States in the case of the last one, Saber Guardian. What is Russia's position regarding these military exercises? Do you see them as being something regular, something normal, or are a source of concern for Moscow?
Well, it is a good question, because it represents certain, I would say, stereotypes disseminated by NATO headquarters. We believe in Russia that NATO lost the rationale of its existence about a quarter of a century ago, roughly at the same time when there was Romanian Revolution, the fall of the Berlin Wall, dissolution of Warsaw Pact organization, and other things. But believe me, that interpretation of the recent evident and very spectacular build-up of military potential of the NATO countries around the borders of Russian Federation, I reiterate, around the national borders of the Russian Federation. All those events, they are just one of the consequences of series of developments in those developments, NATO was always the starter, was always the initiator, starting from expansion towards the east, coming to sponsoring and assisting deployment of elements of American strategic anti-ballistic missile system around our borders, because the original decision was taken by Washington to abandon the ABM treaty signed with the Soviet Union as a part of a big strategic balance of strategic offensive potential and strategic defensive potential. That is why, of course, we can't stay idle looking at those events. I can tell you that according to the provisions of so-called Vienna document of 2011, international monitoring or inspection, if you like, was carried out at those exercises here. And one of our officers took part in that multinational team of inspectors, although, of course, they were not invited to each and every event, briefed very briefly, not in detail. And evidently, we see increased activities of NATO around our borders, not only here, but all around our eastern border. Unfortunately, as a reason and as, if you like, a factor that pushes us to improve our defensive capabilities, and quite recently there was a statement of our defense minister, Mr. Shoigu, who said that development of potential of our southern military district, which includes Crimea, the Crimea, Northern Caucasus, and the Black Sea, is directly linked with the need to neutralize threats to the security of the Russian Federation in the Black Sea region. And there were mentioned in particular deployment, permanent deployment of American and British Air Force units here, and some other points, in particular those exercises or drills, as they sometimes called, which encompassed this time really a substantial number of personnel and military equipment.
Russia is doing some big exercises too. In September, if I'm not wrong, you'll have Zapad. That we don't know that many things about Zapad. Will you be transparent in the scope and the scale of this exercise?
First of all, I can tell you that Zapad, that means West, or the West, 2017, it is just another exercise of this kind that takes place every 2 years. That means that the previous such exercise took place back in 2015. And you shouldn't believe, you shouldn't trust those news that Russia is not transparent, that it is not inviting international foreign observers. It is not true. And this is a regular drill for our armed forces that is necessary to keep their combat readiness. In particular, at the background of deployment of substantial NATO forces along our borders, on the periphery of our borders, which contradicts at least the spirit, not to say about the letter, of the fundamental act signed between Russian Federation and NATO back in the 90s. It was 1997, I believe, or something like that. And it provides for non-deployment of substantial combat forces along the periphery of Russian borders.
Romania in particular is concerned about Crimea. NATO says that you have a huge military build-up there and that you do constant drills there.
After telling me about drills in Romania, I believe you understand that drills, it is a form of activity of all the armed forces in every country in the peacetime. So it is not, so finish with this aspect. As for the Crimea, I can tell you that Crimea, since 18th century, was an avant-post, a military citadel of Russia, at that time Russian Empire, later Soviet Union, now once more of the Russian Federation. Why? And why now we update certain equipment, maybe in particular substitute certain Navy vessels which are getting old, or at least maybe update certain weaponry and systems of armament. This is a natural result, I underscore, of the great 23 years pause when Russian Federation had no such opportunity because of the restrictions imposed on us by the treaties of renting our naval and other military bases in Crimea with Ukraine. You see? But as far as now, we don't see any restrictions or self-restriction on behalf, self-restraint on behalf of NATO. We have to face this additional risk to our national security.
You mentioned earlier Deveselu, and I know your position regarding Deveselu. Romania is thinking now, even made some steps towards buying Patriot defense missile system. What's your position regarding this military acquisition that Romania wants to do?
Well, it is your decision within your alliance in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, within your strategic partnership with the United States. What I can say, I know very well, I'm not a military expert, but I know very well that if it was designed as a defensive, I know that it is rather expensive. What are the forces that those Patriots are going to defend? I can state officially that Russia poses no threat to Romania in no way. And in practice, in reality, those defensive weapons would be deployed to defend foreign military bases, in particular elements of strategic anti-ballistic missile system of the United States at Deveselu. This is the analysis of Russian Federation. It is specificity of our situation when we have to take into consideration, to take into account all kinds of risks around our territory. And if you take a map of the world and look at the deployment and position of American bases, you'll see very interesting picture. I recommend it to you.
You always say that Deveselu is a threat to you, and
this potential risk, because it was very eloquently explained by our even president when he visited Greece last year, that you see, modern equipment depends on many factors. It is not like before when there was a gun and there was a shell, and if shell doesn't fit this gun is useless. Yes, nowadays we have very flexible, very adjustable systems of weaponry, systems of missile systems in particular. And our president explained that according to reliable military intelligence, we know that it is enough to change software, to load another software into the computers running that anti-ballistic missile system, and it will run easily the Tomahawk cruise missile system of America, which is and could be used, which is designed for and could be used for strategic offensive goals. It doesn't mean that it is going to happen tomorrow or something like that. And Tomahawk cruise missiles, they could be armed, equipped with, even with nuclear warheads. This is potential risk that we can't ignore, whether you like it or not.
But a sovereign state can decide to be part of NATO if it wants to.
Have you heard from me something against your sovereign decision? Have I said anything, a single word? I am telling you.
You criticize the expansion, but the expansion is not forced. A country decides to be part of NATO. It's a sovereign decision.
Yes, there was, I've mentioned it, Fundamental Act, which provided for non-deployment. We have heard so many assurances on behalf of the Americans at the time. Now we hear no assurance.
That's a debate for the historians.
That global system is not directed against Russia. It is directed against, I don't know, North Korea and Iran ballistic missile programs and so on and so forth. But in practice, you see, Russians, they have learned many historical lessons. For many times, Russia has been invaded by foreign troops, foreign armies on a global strategic scale. And in this particular case, we are evaluating the practical risks that emerge or could emerge from this or that pattern of deployment, from this or that military equipment deployed here and there. You see, it is our right. It is as far as you insist on your sovereign right to join NATO, or any state to join NATO, we do not deny that. We are telling them that NATO was created to contain ideological communist expansion of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which was a military organization of the socialist countries in Europe. Yes, it is a fact. Where is Warsaw Pact? Where is communism? Russia is not a communist country, believe me. Believe me.
The whole equation...
The whole world has changed.
And it changed a lot after Crimea. So all the drills...
What is about Crimea? What are you reproaching about? That not a single person died, like, for example, during the recent liberation of Mosul, with thousands of civilians perished in the bombardment. Not a single drop of blood shed through the peaceful referendum. You mean that you need those nationalist neo-Nazi Bandera gangs to come into Crimea and club into democracy Russian-speaking population there? You are approaching that? If you are approaching that, then there is no basis for our discussion on this subject, you see? That was free, democratic expression of the will of the population of this peninsula.
Before that was something else.
Before that, what was something else?
Little green men, the so-called little green men that were in Crimea.
They provided security. They didn't have you.
They conquered institutions, military bases.
A single fact that those little green men, for example, I don't know, blocked voting in, I don't know, Crimean Tatar villages, or I don't know, beat some voters, like it was during the elections of Mr. Poroshenko, which are now declared to be very democratic.
Is Russia in any form or mean involved in the conflict in eastern Ukraine now? Because 10,000 people, according to the UN, died in the conflict.
Much more, I believe, have died. Unfortunately, it is the conflict that the West don't want to see in its real perspective, in its real meaning. This is very grave internal conflict of Ukraine, which has full nature of the civil war. And unfortunately, the roots of that conflict are the same that were prevented to be aggravated in Crimea by those little green men.
You didn't answer my question. If Russia is in any form or mean involved in eastern Ukraine.
I can answer this question easily. Russia is not a part of this conflict. It is internal Ukrainian civil conflict.
The United States have a special envoy now for Ukraine, and recently he made two important statements. He said that the United States is thinking about arming the Ukrainian forces, and he said that Russia has more tanks in eastern Ukraine than the whole Western Europe combined.
What I can tell you about his first declaration, it is the political decision, eventual political decision, or an issue that is now scrutinized by Americans. It is their affair. Though I believe that according to major provisions of the international law and different other documents of international character, supplies of arms to the conflict areas, they shouldn't be encouraged. On the statements like Russian tanks, it resembles me the recent reports of CNN about Russian supplies to Taliban, when they were demonstrated some old rifles, maybe Kalashnikovs, which are produced, in fact, in our modern world, starting from China up to Bulgaria, Slovakia. I don't remember whether they are still produced here in Romania. nevertheless, in many countries, yes. And on this very basis, on this very assumption, they claim that Russia is providing Taliban with armaments and God knows what. Russian-made tanks, I saw them in your parade on the 1st of December. Does it mean that Russia invaded Romania? Tell me, frankly. No. Why? Because this equipment was available in Ukraine in abundance.
But it's obvious that the people fighting in eastern Ukraine, the separatists, wouldn't be able to support this conflict financially and military without help.
You believe that they are now flourishing. They are living in very stringent situation in Donbass.
How do you see the conflict in Ukraine ending?
Well, the conflict in Ukraine ending is now not seen. Evidently, the immediate and most effective road to that settlement would be full implementation of the Minsk Accords. But we see that Ukrainian side does not implement those agreements or those provisions of the Minsk Accords at all, under different pretexts. In the front line or in the line of their division between the two sides, there are nationalist battalions that are eager to provoke tensions, that are eager to shell civilian quarters of the neighboring villages and towns. At the level of, for example, Kyiv, in parliament, they claim that they have not enough votes, not enough deputies supporting this decision in Rada, that means in parliament, and so on and so forth. All the social and economic provisions, they were in fact scrapped by those events that I already mentioned. When the nationalists provoked blockade and the government showed itself powerless and, if you like, impotent. And of course, Kyiv is not interested to present the truth. There are all kinds of anecdotes about, for example, special monitoring mission of OSCE. You know what is the nut of those anecdotes in Donbass? They are blind and deaf, those inspectors, blind and deaf, in spite of all their binoculars, in spite of all their drones overflying the positions. Why? Because they don't see any shelling from Ukrainian side of positions. And the shells come from there. As far as they don't see and don't hear, they are blind and deaf. And they are compassionate with them. They say that they are pity for those inspectors. Maybe sometimes they will be, sometime later, they will be cured of their illnesses.
Ambassador, my last question is about Moldova, about Transnistria in particular. The parliament in Moldova asked Moscow to retrieve its the soldiers that Russia has in Transnistria. What's your position regarding this topic?
First of all, I would call upon you to be more strict of the formulations and keep to the facts, because there is, at first I learned it in Arabic, there is such a proverb that the devil is hidden in the details. Moldovans, the leaders of Moldovan parliament, the leaders of those parties, and this time it was interesting coalition of governmental, so to say, Democratic Party and presidential Socialist Party, they voted together in favor of that document. They reiterate that this is a political declaration. And you know that there are no true Russian troops in Transnistria. You should know it. There are peacekeepers. And a training facility that prepares they change on the rotation basis, 1 battalion of peacekeepers. To change it on rotation basis, they represent symbolic presence of Russia according to the tripartite agreements of the 1992, when there was really hot conflict in Transnistria with shooting, with front line, and so on and so forth. As for declarations, we have heard many of them. Unfortunately, I would say that this declaration is not a practical tool, if you like, to make closer the progress in those political negotiations. And on the other side, as well as in any conflict, I reiterate this simple idea. You should ask the Transnistrians about that. What is their opinion? And as far as I know, Transnistrians believe that those peacekeeping mission, should stay in its place till the political settlement is negotiated. It looks very logical.
Ambassador, thank you very much for this interview and for taking the time to
Thank
speak with us.
you. I'm always ready to speak and to present our view. It is one of my professional duties. Thank you.